today's event. It's good to see a nice crowd as we get towards the end of the semester. My name is Greg Brzezinski, and I am the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies here at the Elliott School. I just want to briefly introduce our center and its mission. The purpose of the Seeger Center is to improve the quality of research and education and teaching about the entire Asian region in the Washington, D.C. area and in the surrounding community, and also to promote enhanced dialogue about critical Asian issues between the academic community, our students, and the policy community. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. Today's event on cross-strait relations is part of a longer series of Taiwan-related events that we're always very, very happy to host at the Seeger Center. It's one of the things that is distinctive to our center. I think there's no other center in the DC area that hosts such a wide range of China and East Asia related events, and Taiwan related events that really cover all parts of the region. We're also the only institution in the Washington, D.C. area to be recognized as a Title VI National Resource Center by the Department of Education. And we have more faculty who work on China and Korea than any other school in the DC area. So if you know anyone who's looking to do a policy-related Asian Studies degree, please send them here. We're the best. But I want to introduce first today's moderator. Our moderator is Professor Deepa Alapalli, who it's been a pleasure to work with over the last couple of years as she's the Associate Director of the Seeger Center. She is a research professor at the university, and she is one of the best scholars of South Asian politics and the Indo-Pacific in the country. Please welcome today's moderator, Professor Deepa Alapalli.
Introduction. Welcome everybody. And today, as Greg said, we're here to talk about a very pressing issue. If you follow the news, you'll know that Taiwan has sort of catapulted into the global attention over the last year. Many ways, thanks to the rising pressure and coercion from across the strait in China. As we launch today's event, I should say that this event is the final one for this year for the Seeger Center, and I'm sure we're going to end it on a big high note. I also want to say that in addition to those who are here today, I want to welcome 16 academic scholars, professors, and educators from Taiwan Fulbright who are joining us virtually. And again, this goes to our strength in Taiwan studies that we are offering a pre-departure orientation for them. They're off to Taiwan in a few weeks for a month. So, you know, they're really lucky to be able to do that. So welcome to them. They'll be joining us virtually. All right, so today we have the questions that we're asking today is how are the pressures and the coercion tactics from China, how is it affecting a number of different things, including U.S. strategy and whether or not Cross-Straits is at a crossroad, and that's a question mark. It seems like it's a perpetual question mark. To help us think through these things, we have three terrific speakers today from three different angles. So from a kind of military security angle in terms of what's going on in Cross-Strait and U.S. strategies, the second speaker will be talking about a topic that we don't hear a lot about, that is identity and the politics and identity and ideology in Taiwan and in Cross-Straits, how it affects the politics. And last but not least, we'll talk about the immediate current politics between Taiwan and China, and also US and the implications of the US strategy. That's the kind of bottom line here. So let me introduce the speakers. What we'll do is they will speak for no more than 15 minutes each. I'll start with introducing all of them at one go. First, we'll head off with Dr. Joel Wuthnow. He's a senior research fellow coming from National Defense University. He is an adjunct professor at the Georgetown, which I won't hold against you. He is a well-known expert on the PLA. He's written several books already, but two that I want to point out. One is Crossing the Strait, China's Military Prepares for War with Taiwan. That was last year. 2 years before that, another book called System Overload, Can China's Military Be Distracted in a War Over Taiwan? All right, so he will get us going with looking at military scenarios in the Taiwan Strait. He will be followed by Dr. Rosalie Chen, who is currently an assistant professor of psychology at Dominican University of California. She flew all the way here between her final exams and her graduation tomorrow, so she has to go back and join the students there. She's done a lot of interdisciplinary work, looking specifically at national identity issues in cross-strait relations. And she's particularly interested in exploring the international relations angles of political psychology and culture. She's going to tell us about what's happening with identity in cross-strait relations in this mix of heightened conflict. She has a MA from George Washington University. So a special welcome. And by the way, I want to tell you that one of your old professors, David Shampo, said to specifically give us regards. He couldn't be here. So welcome. All right. And last but not least, we have John Dotson, who is the Deputy Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. That institute is doing a terrific job on Taiwan in the short number of years they've been here. John has done a lot of writing and research on national security issues and politics related to US and East Asia. He has particularly looked at patterns in military coercion by China against Taiwan. He is a former naval officer, and he has a degree from Johns Hopkins. Okay, we're surrounded by a lot of our competitors, but in any case, welcome to everybody. What I'll do is I'll start off. You can either stay there or come up here, John, and then followed by Rosalie. And thank you.
All right, super. Thanks so much. Thanks to GW for the kind invitation to be here this afternoon. So as Deepa mentioned, I'm going to try to review the situation for you from a military point of view currently across the Taiwan Strait. I'm going to start off with just a couple of comments on sort of China's intentions, big picture. Does China actually intend to use force sometime in the next several years in the foreseeable future? I think my bottom line perception on this right now is that the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, they're not satisfied with the status quo, right, by any stretch of the imagination, but they're also not ready to change the status quo through military force right now. So the peacetime strategy of the CCP, so this goes back to Deng Xiaoping's time, it hasn't been working, right? So there's no support, there's very little support on Taiwan for unification with China. There's also, from a Chinese point of view, been a significant hollowing out of US policy towards China with respect to Taiwan. They see us actually walking back and walking away from the one China policy. This combined with more international support for Taiwan in an unofficial capacity, I think, makes the CCP increasingly frustrated with how their peacetime strategy has been performing. The problem here, though, is that from a military lens, the options that they have available to them, the significant options, are all very high risk and would create potentially kind of strategic costs for the CCP that outweigh the value in keeping the status quo intact. So no real good military solution to this problem right now. And so for that reason, I don't see Xi Jinping boxing himself in. This has been kind of a source of debate here in Washington for the last couple of years, but I don't see Xi actually boxing himself into some sort of an arbitrary time for unification through military force, whether it's 2027 or some other date. I don't think he has a reason to do that. I don't think he would intentionally do that, because once you get to that date, you may still find that the conditions simply aren't right. And so why set yourself up for failure when you don't need to do that? No one domestically is demanding him to do that. And so he has no particular need to. So that's sort of a bit on the intentions. I don't see use of force as particularly likely. And now I'm going to kind of explain why that's the case from a military perspective. So the big problem here is that the PLA really is ready for major military operations across the Taiwan Strait. So, you know, this is something that certainly influences their calculations. But I think, as most analysts who have looked at this will agree with, an invasion, so this is sort of the higher end contingency, this is still an incredibly high risk proposition. A few reasons for this, in addition to the sort of enduring problem of Taiwan being an island with identifiable beaches and tough weather conditions and all those sorts of things. But why, from a PLA point of view, is this still problematic? First, I think we have to realize that logistics and sustainment are critical to any kind of military operations. But if you're talking about crossing 100 nautical miles of water, invading an island, you know, this is even more challenging than what Russia has faced in Ukraine, which you can roll over land. Right, so Taiwan's island geography is a blessing and a curse. You're prone to blockade. I think everyone realizes that. But if you're talking about an invasion, there's a significant limitation there for the PLA. And they don't have enough lift. This is a critical military question. You have to be able to transport troops and equipment across the Taiwan Strait. The PLA hasn't built enough of it. And so in the book that Deepa mentioned called Crossing the Strait, we calculated that for the amphibious forces, they have about half of what they need in terms of the sea lift. And for the airborne forces, they have about a third. So this really just isn't enough. They're doing experiments, which I'll talk about, but they just simply don't have the capacity to do it. In terms of experience, and this is sort of the human capital dimension, also a critical factor when you're analyzing sort of military effectiveness. It's often said that the PLA lacks combat experience. This is a fact since 1979, 1980. But I think more to the point, they lack modern joint experience in sort of modern joint operations of the type that the US has been honing and perfecting since the 1980s. The PLA has none of it outside of their training exercises. So I don't think of themselves as particularly confident that in real war conditions, they have the human capital, the leadership in the PLA to be able to plan, organize, carry out, and adapt on the battlefield in these difficult circumstances. And then the final problem here, I think, is that the Cross-Strait contingency from a Chinese point of view is not limited. This is something that cannot really currently be contained to a battle between China, which of course has a military advantage, and Taiwan itself. The US would have to intervene, but likely not just that, but US allies could intervene. Japan, Australia, even now these days, almost unthinkable from a few years ago, even the Philippines is talking about their own role, right, in a Taiwan contingency. And so this is not the war that China wants to face. They want a narrow battle between them and a small adversary. They don't want to fight a large regional conflict against a nuclear power rival. So it's not the war they would want. All right, so these are some of the limitations. What progress, though, are they making? So from the DoD's perspective, right, the Taiwan contingency has now started to be called the primary planning scenario. Right, this is the last year or two. For the PLA, the Taiwan contingency has been their primary planning scenario since 1993. Okay, so for 30 years, this has been the top contingency they've been wrestling with and thinking about. So they are acutely aware of these problems, and they've been taking steps over the years, especially under Xi Jinping, to try to correct some of these problems. So with respect to the transportation issue, they've been thinking about alternative ways of crossing the strait that doesn't require them to build large fleets of military sea lift. Experimenting, just for example, with civilian ferries. We've seen a lot of that experimentation go on in the last couple of years. In terms of the experience, the quality, the depth of China's sort of combat-oriented training exercises has become much more significant, I think, over the last decade or even 2 decades. They're getting experience now, in practically speaking, and we've seen this over the last 6 months with the response to first Speaker Pelosi's visit in August, and then to the Taiwan Strait, the transit by President Tsai recently. But the PLA has actually gone out and has been operating all around Taiwan. And so this is actually real experience they can leverage in terms of how do you actually make all the pieces work together from a operations perspective. So they're trying to, in their own way, close the gap between the experience they need and the experience that they have. And then finally, how do you keep this conflict narrow? How do you keep the United States at bay? Well, I think for the most part, China's been looking at Russia's performance in Ukraine and said, we're not, we're really disappointed in how the Russians are performing. But there's one area in which I think they've been pleasantly surprised, and that has been Putin's ability to keep U.S. troops off the ground and airplanes out of the sky, largely as a result of nuclear signaling at the start of the conflict. So from the Chinese perspective, they're interested in this. I think they're curious as to whether or not they can recreate those circumstances in a Taiwan contingency. And especially in the context of a much larger, more diversified nuclear arsenal for the PLA. So could that be a way in the future for them to deter U.S. intervention? Perhaps. And so all of this combined with steps they're taking internally to make themselves more self-sufficient and resilient to international sanctions, I think is changing the situation, slowly changing the risk calculus. So what to expect for the future, the next 3 or 4 years? Certainly now we're in a new normal. This is a cliche when we talk about a new normal across the Taiwan Strait. But I think now we're going to be seeing much larger, more frequent PLA exercises that are multi-domain exercises all around the Taiwan as a form not only of psychological warfare against the island, but as a practical training experience for their forces. So I think that's something that we're going to see more of. There's a debate now, sort of in analytic circles, about whether we could actually see them transition into a real blockade. And so if we're not talking about a real invasion, then what about a blockade? Personally, I think this is an unattractive option for the CCP, because what you're doing there is you're absorbing some of the costs and the risks of war. So you're going to be sanctioned and you're going to invite potential US intervention in this, but without the guarantee of actually being able to conquer Taiwan. So you could absorb some of the costs of the war, but without a real clear reward. And what this would also do for the Taiwan's point of view is if you look at Ukraine 2014, Russia did a partial invasion in Crimea. That's what really got the Ukrainians galvanized to get serious about their own defense reforms. And so what I think the Chinese could end up doing if they try to do this sort of partial solution is to really galvanize even more than they already are, to galvanize Taiwan, to give them their own sort of Crimea moment. And so ultimately you're actually in a worse off position militarily than if you hadn't done it to begin with. And so for the same reasons, I think it's unlikely that the PLA, even though it's a militarily tenable option, I don't think they would actually try to seize one of the offshore islands if they have to use lethal force. Again, you're absorbing some of the costs of war without actually gaining your primary objective, which is control over the island, the main island. And so finally, let me kind of comment a little bit about what needs to be done from the US point of view, from Taiwan's point of view, in terms of deterrence, right? So that's the other buzzword that goes on these days in DoD circles, integrated deterrence. So how to think about this. The first thing I want to point out here is that with a new normal of heightened military activities around Taiwan, we're going to see a real prospect of some sort of an accident, so accidental or inadvertent escalation involving China, even potentially with the United States, even more so than we are today. And yet today we have no functioning mil-to-mil relationship with the PLA. And so this is a dangerous circumstance, and I worry that in the heightened political context, how would both sides walk back such a crisis? How could we do that? It was very difficult to do that in 2001 with EP3 incident. If that happened again tomorrow, which it very well could, how would we deal with that? What ramifications would that have for US-China relations? So rebuilding some of our mil-to-mil connectivity with the PLA just to simply be able to handle those sorts of incidents, I think is very important. In terms of sort of classic deterrence, well, I think one thing that we're observing from the Ukraine conflict is that low cost and mobile precision weapons can actually be very useful for the defense. In modern warfare, that's something that's I think very clear to us as American observers. And it's also clear to I think it's fairly clear to the Chinese, right? That Taiwan, although it has a limited defense budget, it can purchase a lot of UAVs and other systems, such as leave it at that. That would make an invasion very, very complicated for the PLA, taking a page from the Ukraine defense. And so I think keeping that up. But it's not just a matter of arms sales, and that's really what a lot of the attention has been focused on. It's also training Taiwan forces to use that equipment. It's about organizational reforms to the command and control system. It's about building and resolving some of the severe manpower problems that they face in their military, so that you have the equipment, but also the software that's able to use that stuff. I also want to highlight the very real possibility that the US would intervene. I would highlight that to the Chinese. I want to try to dissuade them of the idea that we can be easily sidelined, not just us, but potentially some of our allies as well. I don't want the Chinese to think that the Ukraine case is similar to the Taiwan case. U.S. national interests with Taiwan, I think, manifestly are much more significant than they are with Ukraine. I think it would be much more difficult to keep the U.S., Japan, and potentially other allies out of the conflict. And so I don't want them to think that the nuclear card is a magic bullet that they can use to try to limit the conflict. Finally, in terms of sort of coercion, I think, probably everyone here has read Tom Schelling. When we talk about coercion, you can't just have military tools, right? You also have to have some degree of reassurance. And this has become sort of a loaded word, I think, in DC debates because it's sort of equated with accommodation or acquiescence, but it's not that. Reassurance is saying, communicating to China that as long as they don't cross our red lines, we're going to try not to cross theirs. Their worst fears are not going to come about if they exercise some level of restraint. And so I think from a U.S. Point of view, I think we have to be careful with our own policy. Are we actually hollowing out the one China policy? Because if we do that, then I think China has less reason, and they're more convinced of the idea that their peacetime strategy is just complete and abject failure. I think that would lead them into a much worse position than if we're careful with this. And so as we head into the election season, right, not just in Taiwan, but also in the United States, I think there will be more and more incentives for politicians and candidates and others to want to do very high value, high visibility, symbolic gestures. Intentions are good, okay? But from the point of view of deterrence, I think some of these can be actually counterproductive. And I'm actually not convinced that there's a huge appetite for those sorts of gestures, even in Taiwan. And so I would encourage U.S. Elected officials and others to be very careful, just from the point of view of reassuring China that if they hold back, then we will also do our part and have a better outcome for it. So let me stop there and turn to you.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was a very sobering account. And thank you for putting a very complex set of dynamics in bite-sized chunks that I think we all appreciate. So that said, given the kind of high tension background and backdrop in Cross-Strait, let me now turn to Rosalie Chen and ask, how is the identity and ideology in Taiwan shaping Cross-Strait perceptions, given what we've just heard? Period. So you feel free to go up. That's right. I think you have a PowerPoint. Yes, please.
Hi, I am extremely thrilled to be back here today to share with you some of my more recent research findings on ideology, identity, and cross-strait relations. So I know I have limited time, so I'm just gonna get right into it. So first, we're going to examine identity and policy preferences concerning cross-strait relations. So this is the latest poll from NCCU's website. You can see here in terms of identifying as Taiwanese, the trend has been in steady increase, right? As opposed to a dual identity, both identifying as Chinese and Taiwanese, it's been in decline, and even more sharply for those who only identify as Chinese, right? The blue line, right? So the question that we were interested in finding out was, how does Taiwanese national identity predict policy preferences toward military? Okay. So very quickly, we surveyed close to 1,500 nationally represented samples online, and this was right about this time last year that we collected data. So just to sort of give an idea of what kind of measures we actually used in the survey. to gauge participants' national identification, we used 3 items, including this one right here, the fact that I'm Taiwanese, and it's part of my identity, and they were asked to respond on a scale from 1 to 7, with the higher score indicating for Taiwanese identification. And we asked them questions on their stance is under 2 conditions. The first is in the current situation, so in other words, without repercussions, and the second is with repercussions. And then the other measures included, as I mentioned, the primary DB policy priority, and we examined the policy preferences in 4 different domains, including politics, economics, military, and culture, just to have a more nuanced idea of people's different policy preferences. And also we asked them to report their party affiliation on a scale also from 1 to 7, with the higher score indicating a more sort of blue affiliation. So in terms of the results, we conducted correlation analysis. And this is the main results, but the main interest, of course, is the top column, right? And there is the significant correlations between national identity and also the different variables I just mentioned. Okay, so to sum up really quickly, we see that the higher, the more participants identified as Taiwanese, the higher their preference for cross-strait except in the military domain. So in other words, also including in the political domain. Okay, such as more cooperation on issues of more like a global thing, like climate change, or like combating the pandemic or okay, so that is we found quite interesting. And then secondly, right, the more they identify as Taiwanese, they higher and stronger their support for Taiwan independence with or without repercussions. Okay, so that is also quite encouraging. And then lastly, but not least, also the more they identify as Taiwanese, the stronger their affiliation with, broadly speaking, pan-green political parties in Taiwan. So that's sort of like the first part of the study. And then secondly, we also wanted to examine ideology and perceptions of cross-strait relations. And this is largely because in the political psychology literature, it's been pointed out that the policies that we support, in especially in conflicts such as in the cross-strait context, are actually strongly predicted by our political ideology or ideological orientation, right? So, and in another study that I conducted with collaborators, we found that those who self-identified as being on the right as opposed to being on the left of the ideological spectrum favored more pro-China policies overall. So in this second part of the study, we wanted to investigate how does ideology actually predict Taiwanese perceptions of cross-strait relations. And also, very quickly, to give you an idea of what kind of items we asked to gauge participants' ideological orientation, we asked them to self-report their ideological leanings in terms of political, economic, and cultural dimensions. So three different dimensions of ideology. And then in terms of their perceptions of China, we included 9 items in 3 different domains, again, economic, political, and cultural, just to have a more nuanced understanding. And also we asked them to not only, so we try to tease apart different aspects of perceptions, perception of China, right, as like a country, and perception of the Chinese people. And in terms of the Chinese people, we included 5 different items, gauging their perception of Chinese students. In Taiwan, there used to be some a couple of years ago, a little bit less now, but, and also Chinese politicians, tourists in Taiwan, spouses, which are actually increasing in number, and also dissidents. We also ask them to report their perception, also indicate their perception of conflict. We ask them, in your opinion, how likely is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in the next 10 years? And also their perception of the of a Chinese democracy. Do you believe that China will become democratic one day? So that was also one item included in our survey, and also we asked them to again report their stance on independence with and without repercussions. And we ran regression analysis with the data that we collected, and to share with you, first of all, quickly, to tie also this with the first study. So what are the relationships between ideology, identity, and political parties? So here you can see the more participants identify as Taiwanese, the less likely they were to place themselves on the right, but the more likely they are to affiliate themselves with pan-green parties in Taiwan. So that's the first sort of aspect of the findings. And then secondly, in terms of their stance on independence, you see here that compared to those who place themselves on the right, the left tended to be more supportive of Taiwan independence. And this finding actually also replicated prior findings that, as I mentioned, that I conducted with other collaborators in another research. And then in terms of their perception of Cross-Strait conflict, we actually did not find a significant difference between the two camps, and that's because, as you can see here in the paper, both actually perceive quite a high likelihood of Cross-Strait conflict. That's why you don't really see the difference between the two groups. So hold on to that thought, and I'll touch that in a little bit. In terms of perception of Chinese democracy, again, we see that compared to those who place themselves on the right, those on the left tended to perceive a less positive outlook for Chinese democracy. So the orange bar always indicates identifies being on the right. Okay, and then in terms of perception of the Chinese people, you can see here again pretty much across the board, right? So overall, the left compared to the right demonstrates stronger negative perception of the Chinese people in all 5 different sort of categories. Okay. And then the perception of like the country of China as a country, again, right? So we see a similar pattern. That people compared to people who place themselves on the right, the left tended to perceive China in a more negative light. So in all the domains of economic, political, and also housing. So somehow very quickly. So we actually do see high perception of cross-strait conflict, of course, both camps in terms of ideological orientation, and then overall, those who identify with the left tended to demonstrate significantly more negative perception of cross-strait relations, and that so the second part of the research was we were hoping to sort of because we actually don't see a lot of discussion on this factor or this variable, political ideology, and how that might shape perceptions, so liberal behavior when it comes to IR international relations. So we are hoping to sort of bring this also into the discussion by highlighting sort of we can see consistent differences between those who identify more with the right versus left. And also, maybe if I could share very, very quickly, because also we have 2 very intriguing findings that I would like to bring to your attention. The first is we also examine emotions when it comes to cross-strait relations, and you can see here very quickly, and we see that positively updated emotions have positive, right? When people think of cross-strait relations, that have 3 right emotions, anxiety, threat, and anger. Right? So, in particular, when they think about cross-strait communication. So that's, very intriguing. We found and actually doing more follow-up studies, to this. And then secondly, we asked them, so this is an open-ended question. Please use just one word to describe cross-strait, that cross-strait relation. I mean, this, yeah. So, and we created a word to demonstrate our results. So you can see here, right? How the answers: tense, terrible, dangerous. Okay, which in turn sort of kind of also echo the previous slide terms of more like native emotions. So
Firstly, thank you so much for giving us another glimpse into an area that we normally don't see, the way in which you capture the emotional elements, as well as, of course, what is on the minds of Taiwanese as they face this challenging times. And this is a perfect segue into our last speaker, last but not least, who will be talking about the current political situation in cross-strait relations and the implications of the United States strategy. So bringing it kind of full circle. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. I want to say thanks both to Dr. Olapali and to the Sigler Center for inviting me to speak here today. Very humble to be on this panel. It's a bit challenging batting cleanup after other very distinguished speakers. It's a bit like putting the warm-up band on stage after the headliner has already finished their set. But I'll do my best. I should start off, I guess, with a very quick introduction to my organization. The Global Taiwan Institute is we're a small 501c3 think tank located here in Washington, D.C. Been around for about 6 years. And as our name might suggest, we're very specifically focused on Taiwan-related issues and U.S.-Taiwan relations. I should also offer my past time in government has left me with a reflexive brainwashing to offer a disclaimer that the views I'd be offering here today are my own and not meant to represent those of GTI or another organization. But anyway, I was asked to speak, I guess, to some of the broader trends affecting cross-strait relations and some of the political and geopolitical aspects of it. And as I was thinking about sort of that question or that task, I guess in any, I guess you have to speak of it in terms of a trilateral relationship, that of between the U.S., Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China, the PRC. And so in any trilateral relationship, in any triangle, you've got 3 points. So I guess I'll talk about each one of those individually, or try to take those one at a time. I guess starting off talking about larger trends in U.S.-China relations and how that affects the tensions of the situation in the Taiwan Strait. I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone here for me to say that U.S.-China, by that I mean U.S.-PRC relations have deteriorated pretty substantially over the past few years. I have memories going back a number of years. So I used to work for a time on the staff of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and I can remember at that time, not more than 10 years ago, while we were very proud of the work that we did, I think there were parts of official Washington that rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, looked upon us as a group of semi-respectable hardliners poisoning U.S.-China relations. I would always say, well, look at our footnotes if you disagree. But I actually think it's striking how over the last few years, the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C., how dramatically it has changed and how much it now aligns with what organizations like the USCC might have been saying or publishing 10 years ago. There's been a real sea change in terms of the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. And I think there's multiple reasons for that. None of that is monocausal. But I think trade frustrations is a big part of it. I think to an extent that perhaps the general public may not appreciate or realize for many, many years now, and I'm talking 20 years, a quarter century, I think the U.S. business community has quietly acted as the effective lobbyist for the Chinese government in Washington, D.C. And there were multiple elements to that. There was the hope among the business community. I think both the expectations of what the China market might offer, as well as the lower production costs of manufacturing and sourcing in China, as well as the ideological expectation that went along with, I think, what was called in very broad terms, the Washington Consensus that emerged in the late 80s or the 90s. The idea that liberalized trade would inevitably bring with it political reform and democratization and all sorts of other wonderful things. In my own personal opinion, I think those hopes were very naive. They always were, but they still held great sway, I think, in Washington policymaking for many years. But that has changed, I think. I think that sense of naivete is passing from the scene. It also had a lot to do with Chinese government behavior. It's very provocative behavior in terms of militarizing the South China Sea and claiming effective sovereignty over the entirety of the South China Sea, as well as sort of obnoxious wolf warrior diplomacy and other elements as well. But there's been a very substantial downturn in U.S.-China relations, and that connects to sort of the improvement, sort of the very dramatic improvement or expansion of U.S.-Taiwan ties and U.S.-Taiwan relations. Again, I think if we go back in time, 10 years or more, 10, 20 years, U.S. relations with Taiwan were often treated as a small subset of U.S.-China relations. And in many respects, I think Taiwan was, again, not to editorialize too much, but I would argue unfairly, was almost looked upon as sort of an irritant, or this sort of embarrassing, irritating problem affecting U.S.-China relations that we just couldn't seem to get past. And also, I think going back in time, U.S.-Taiwan relations tended to be very much characterized to an excessive degree in terms of the focus on arms sales. And I think going back to the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and again, it just seems like much of the relationship was focused on the will they or won't they romantic comedy tension as to whether or not arms sales were going to be approved at a particular time, and with arms sales often being held up because of concerns of how it would affect relations with the PRC. If we have a climate change negotiation, let's put this off another 6 months or a year until we can get agreement on that, on issue X or whatever the case may be. I think all this began to change quite dramatically during the Trump administration, and I think that trend has continued into the Biden administration, and not just with the issue of arms sales, although those have certainly opened up. That's a separate topic, but in a much broader sense, the greater openness to diplomatic connections, and again, not necessarily official diplomatic connections, but I don't know what you'd call them, unofficial, official, unofficial, government to government diplomatic connections between the U.S. government and Taiwan's government. And again, I think there are multiple reasons for that. One part of it, I think, is a growing and genuine ideological sympathy for Taiwan in policy circles in Washington, D.C. Perhaps 20 years ago, we were overly enamored of the prospects for democratic reform in the PRC. Well, lo and behold, there is an actual democratic state just off of China's coast, Taiwan, which is under threat by the PRC. So I think there's some genuine element of ideological sympathy. I think part of it is realpolitik as well, as U.S.-China relations have deteriorated, and sort of that old optimistic consensus in Washington, D.C. Is being replaced by degrees with a much more pessimistic one and a growing sense of threat from China. Well, lo and behold, there's a state just off of China's coast that is being militarily threatened by China. And I think there's a third element of it as well that connects to U.S. domestic politics, and again, going along with the deterioration in U.S.-China relations, demonstrating support for Taiwan. And again, I'm thinking most particularly in terms of figures from the legislative branch of the U.S. government. Showing support for Taiwan is sort of a means of showing that you're tough on China. And so I think that element of it has entered into the picture as well. And if you put all that together, and if you look back over the course of the last few years, you can see that as U.S.-China relations have deteriorated, U.S.-Taiwan relations have opened up fairly considerably. I guess getting to the third point of the triangle, that would be a sort of cross-strait relations, or relations between Taiwan and the PRC. And so where do those stand now? Well, they're pretty frozen, actually, at least in terms of overt and public governments to government ties. I can't claim to know everything that maybe might be going on behind the scenes, but I see a lot of evidence of it. But in terms of open government to government ties, the cross-strait relationship is pretty much in deep freeze right now, and it has been for several years. When the administration of Tsai Ing-wen came into office after the 2016 elections, Beijing seemed to make it pretty clear to take out a position that they were going to attempt to deny any legitimacy whatsoever to the Democratic Progressive Party government. There had been a number of overtures or openings under the previous Kuomintang or KMT administration of Ma Ying-jeou that preceded that. But once Tsai Ing-wen's administration came in, with a DPP majority in the legislature as well, by the way, the PRC seemed to make it pretty clear that they were just going to freeze them out, to deny them all legitimacy. The PRC makes regular propaganda broadsides identifying Taiwan's government as considered as being separatist in nature. Again, their term, not mine. A separatist inclusion with unnamed foreign forces, but we all know who those sinister foreign forces are, right? And there really hasn't been much to speak of in terms of progress in cross-strait relations on the diplomatic side. As Joel was talking a little bit about or alluding to earlier, there's certainly been coercive military pressure directed against Taiwan, sometimes in conjunction with political events. There's been coercive economic pressure in terms of selected boycotts. You know, when Chinese customs inspectors suddenly decide, oh, there are dangerous insects that we found in, monk fruit. Monk fruit is banned now, and so on and so forth. And now, I would argue that, at least from the Beijing side of things, or from the PRC side of things, they're somewhat stuck in a political paradigm in which they can't really pursue a great deal of progress. The PRC's official position is that, well, first off, that Taiwan is a province of China, and that there is one China and only one China, and that is the People's Republic of China, period. That they don't offer a great deal of wiggle room for negotiation. The official sort of PRC framework or position is that Taiwan must be reunified, again, their term, not mine, under the framework of what they call one country, two systems, and this is a framework that has been around since the late 70s. It was promulgated under Deng Xiaoping, with the general idea behind it being, okay, hey, we will formally unify, we'll just swap out the flags, but not much will actually change for you in terms of your society and how you go about living your life. Things aren't going to change much for your society, and so on and so forth. It was the same deal that was theoretically laid out for the PRC sort of reabsorption or unification with Hong Kong. Now, I would argue, I think if you look at public opinion polling, the one country, two systems never had a lot of traction in Taiwan to begin with. Some limited traction on sort of the deeper blue pro-unification side of the political spectrum, but it's decidedly that's decidedly a minority view. I mean, it never had much traction to begin with before the crackdown in Hong Kong. And I would argue, anyway, that the PRC's crackdown in Hong Kong has shown the whole idea of one country, two systems to be hollow. And that as as Xi Jinping and as the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party views the matter, one country, two systems is one country, one system. And I think that message has come through pretty clearly in Taiwan. And in fact, I mean, it's difficult to quantify, but I think most people who have looked at the Taiwan's election in 2020 would argue that the crackdown in Hong Kong may have played a substantial role in boosting support for Tsai Ing-wen and hoping to secure her re-election. Along with that, so there's another, not exactly framework, but concept that the PRC pushes called the 1992 consensus or the 92 consensus. And if you're not familiar with that, it's basically a bit of verbal political jujitsu by which that was applied retroactively to negotiations in the early 90s between representatives of the Guangdong and KMT, again, prior to Taiwan's full democratization, when the KMT still ran all levers of government. But negotiations between the representatives of the KMT and of the CCP. And sort of the general idea is that, okay, we're both going to agree that there's one China. You have your definition of what China is. So that's the People's Republic of China. We have our definition of what China means, the Republic of China, and we'll just kind of fudge that, and we'll conduct negotiations on that basis. Again, that idea has been pretty stale for a while, but the PRC continues to assert it. Actually, I think over the last year to 18 months, they've actually sort of revived a propaganda effort to push it even harder. Although, again, the PRC's definition of the 1992 consensus is that there's one China, it's the People's Republic of China, and that's it. So even that supposed framework, as the PRC pushes it, really doesn't offer much opening or flexibility for real negotiations between the two sides. So in terms of cross-strait relations, or at least on the sort of political or diplomatic side of cross-strait relations, that is pretty much frozen. There's not much to point to there. Now, what could that mean going forward? Well, you can expect political continuity in Beijing. Xi Jinping has just secured a third term as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And my prediction anyway is that barring a sudden heart attack or stroke, you're going to see Xi Jinping running the country for the next 20, 25 years until he drops dead. In Taiwan, you're looking at there are party dynamics at play that could certainly affect the future of relations across the strait and with the U.S. Tsai Ing-wen is term limited, so we'll be stepping out at the end of this next term for Taiwan's next presidential election. Well, if the DPP candidate, so that's Vice President Lai, comes in, he's promising a great deal of continuity with Tsai Ing-wen's policies. He's generally viewed as being a little deeper green, more pro-independence, but he's certainly taking on a position of promising continuity with Tsai Ing-wen's policies, which I think you'd have to say objectively have been pretty moderate and pragmatic. The KMT, and actually Rosalie gave us a great presentation on some issues of identity connect to that. The KMT, the largest opposition party, their candidate, whoever that person is, could come in the next presidential election. The KMT has a lot of internal conflicts centered around the idea of identity, and in some ways that make it difficult for it to compete in sort of national level elections in Taiwan, with the KMT having a significant part of its base that is committed to close relations with the PRC and even to unification. And those views can hold a lot of sway within the party and in internal party primaries, but may not sell all that well with the electorate as a whole. But I'm not going to try to make a prediction as to who's going to win the next election. Stay tuned on that. I think, well, I could almost, I spoke before about a triangle. I think in light of some recent changes and some recent developments, you could also maybe start to speak of a square, because I think you might almost have to talk about a fourth point in terms of regional dynamics, because there have been some rather startling developments just in the last few weeks, last few months, that, again, I think from Beijing's perspective would have to be very alarming. And that's in terms of the tighter security relationships that are forming now between the United States and some of its traditional security treaty allies in the Pacific, being Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and South Korea. And for example, just over the past month, we saw state visits by the presidents of South Korea and the Philippines, both of whom were willing to say in public and to put into joint statements with the Biden administration, statements of concern about the Taiwan Strait, of a sort that would have been really hard to see just a few years ago. There's been a lot of there's been a pretty dramatic shift in that direction as well. However, I think that could almost be opening up a whole nother topic, if not a whole nother panel discussion. And I don't want to run too much over on my time. So I think I'll draw it to a close there, and I'll look forward to any questions or comments you might have in the Q&A.
For looking deeply into the triangular teams, political teams. While you and the audience formulate your questions, and also I invite the Fulbrighters online to also submit the questions you might have, I will just start off by asking a question to my panelists. What struck me in listening to all your presentations is, first of all, the somewhat disconnect between the Taiwanese perceptions on the Chinese threat and the possibility of an invasion or a direct military challenge, versus what Joel, you suggest is lack of good options for the Chinese, and also and that has made it less likely for any kind of urgent military action, let's say even 10 years. I don't know what your timeline was. And I guess the overarching question in some sense for me is, you know, both Joel and I studied under Bob Jervis, where perceptions are very, very important, for very different years, I have to say. Okay, so, but the role of perceptions and political perceptions. So the question is, can perceptions and identity and politics, can it overcome what might be military structural limitations? You know, or is it in Taiwan, are they having a worst case scenario kind of outlook? Or I'm just wondering how you would respond to that, and if I could just go down, each of you take their views on that. Thanks.
It's a very interesting question, and you know, I have to admit that I'm less familiar with the state of Taiwan's public opinion than Rosalie. I think in my general view is that, you know, if you go back 6 months or so after Speaker Pelosi's visit, it seemed to me that a lot of the reporting from Taiwan indicated not so much alarm, right, and not complacency, but somewhere in the middle, that we think there's a problem, we think there's a challenge, but we don't think that the sky's gonna fall. It's almost the same attitude that you would have found in Kyiv at the end of January 2022. We think there's a problem, we don't think they're really coming for us. So that seems to be a little bit of the situation. I would say that, this to me is something that could create problems, right? If there's not an adequate level of popular support for tough choices, right? Given sort of Taiwan's limited defense budget, the fact that you have to parcel it out in different ways, you have classic guns versus our problem, and then compounded by the idea that military service really isn't that attractive of an option. Combined with President Tsai's, I think, useful but limited steps to try to mandate greater service on the part of the very small population that they have. So what does this add up to? Well, I think it adds up to probably a limitation on their ability to make tough choices. The good news for them, though, is that you don't necessarily have to spend an arm and a leg to get better defense readiness for Taiwan. As I said earlier, I think one of the key takeaways from Ukraine has been that a lot of the stuff that they're using really effectively is just kind of commercial off-the-shelf technology. I was happy to see that Taiwan's defense ministry just over the last few months has announced that they're going to be investing more in creating indigenous UAVs. And these are really problematic for a PLA invasion. In fact, there is an article from China's Academy of Military Science, which has been a little bit silent on this topic, saying that in Ukraine, what we notice is that military systems or dual use systems that cost a few $1,000s have taken down high value platforms worth tens of millions of dollars on the battlefield there. And that's exactly the kind of problem they're going to face. And so I think, from Taiwan's point of view, you need the public to be energized, but you also need to make smart investment choices so that they're not going to be running out their budgets. But I think they can do that. I think they can do it.
Go ahead.
I would just like to add a note because we collected our data right about this time last year. So it was right around the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it might have influenced the response a little bit, because we see indeed, right, the perception of cross-strait conflict was quite high. And then secondly, I think perhaps a little bit unfortunately, in Taiwan as well as like here in the US, right? A lot of times it's the perception of a conflict depends a lot on what kind of facts you see, right? And we get a lot of that from the media, right? So yes. So and Joe mentioned that he doesn't think the PLA is ready yet to take over in Taiwan, but I'm not sure if that is a common understanding about the Taiwanese public. And also there was an op-ed in about 2 days ago. I think the irony here is on one hand, we see growing perception of a conflict across the strait, but on the other hand, there is argued to be increasing sentiment of like an anti-war. Even sometimes people argue anti-US among the Taiwan public. So I think those are, from my perspective, all very good fruits for further exploration. So
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. John?
Okay. That's a pretty tough question as to why there's a difference in threat perceptions. I'm not a psychologist, but I could perhaps share maybe an anecdote or two. I think it is true that up to now, or maybe not so recently, there has been a fairly decided difference in threat perceptions that sometimes has puzzled people in the U.S. military. For example, like why are the Taiwanese taking their defense more seriously? They're the ones with the sort of Damocles hanging over them. It's not us. I mean, why aren't they taking this seriously? I actually do think that the Taiwan's government and its armed forces actually are starting to take the threat they're facing a lot more seriously now. I think Ukraine has proved a wake-up call to them in that respect. It sort of shocked people out of maybe a reflexive assumption that large conventional state versus state wars just don't happen anymore in the modern world. Going back further in time, and this would be going way back, I'm definitely dating myself. I think if you go back a generation or two, and again, this is me playing unqualified amateur psychologist. In Taiwan, much of the population, this certainly came up through the martial law era, was first sort of internalized the message, stay out of politics, pursue business, worry about that, worry about your family, don't get engaged in politics or, stick your neck out and get it whacked. I think also during that, for people who grew up during the martial law period, the period of the KMT dictatorship, there was a constant propaganda drumbeat to be ready for war with the communists and be ready to do Fangong Dalu. And I think to an extent that, again, for many people who grew up during that era, it just sort of became something that you reflexively like laughed off or waved away. I was teaching English in Taiwan in the mid-90s, and we had a unit where the vocabulary was all about different types of music, different genres of music. So I was asking the students in the class, like, tell me, what's your favorite kind of music? What's your favorite song? And the class smart aleck in one class jumped up and said, Fang Gong Dalu, to counterattack the mainland song. And it got a big laugh throughout the class. And so I think perhaps because of that constant diet of top-down propaganda, many people in Taiwan, again, just sort of came to reflexively laugh off the idea that there was any threat from the PRC. I was living in Taiwan in 1996 during the first, during, I guess, what was the third Taiwan Strait crisis. I remember watching international news sources where they're playing this immense era of crisis with missiles splashing in the water off of Taiwan. But again, it's like talking to people, normal day-to-day interactions, walking down the street, people were just kind of largely shrugging it off. There was almost like a sense of disconnection, or I can't really do anything about it, so I'm getting on with my life. So perhaps I think over the course of decades, there was a sense of disassociation set up, perhaps, between the individual citizen and a role in the defense of the island. And I think now perhaps there's a bit of cognitive dissonance taking place where, oh, there actually is a real threat now. Well, now what do we do about that? And I think also tied in with that is, and Joel made an allusion to this, in Taiwan, military service has not been highly respected or highly regarded. And again, you could get into a longer discussion as to the reasons for that. But again, just one small personal anecdote, small but telling. When I was getting ready to leave Taiwan in '96, after living there for a couple of years, I was getting ready to come back to America. I had plans to join the military. And I ultimately did go to Navy Officer Candidate School. I served as a Navy officer for several years. But anyway, I was having English conversation sessions with some of my students, and they asked me, well, John, what do you plan to do after you go back to America? And I would say, oh, well, I'm looking into trying to pursue a commission as a military officer. Oh, John, no. What? Why would you want to throw your life away like that? You can get a real job. You don't have to do that. So the
John.
It was just, and for young men who were getting ready to do their obligatory 2 years of military service, they would just talk about it like it was an impending prison sentence. So military service, I would say, was really just not respected, like actively disrespected. It sort of carried low social status with it. And that cultural attitude has carried itself over to the present day and affects things like, recruitment and retention. So.
Okay, all right, I think you have a second career as a psychologist, but in any case, thank you for your patience, audience. We have a couple of questions on that as well. So we have several people here. Let's see, where are the people with the mics? Okay, Jess, why don't I take this young man right up front? Please identify your name and your affiliation and your question short.
First, Bill Wang from University of Maryland. A question for Joe. So I grew up in the coastal Chinese city of Xiamen, so I can see the islands of Jinmen from my window. So it's a very personal for this issue for me. My question is, between the status quo and the total conquest and control of Taiwan, so between these two, what is the expectation that you think Xi Jinping is looking for? What's the maximum concession he's expecting to get without starting a war? What's that? And what is the maximum amount of concession the US and Taiwan is possible to give without a war? So, and is there any overlap between the demand from China and what the US and Taiwan is willing to give?
Sounds like a back channel.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting question, and without being in Xi Jinping's mind or understanding his bottom line, I mean, I think what he's really trying to do in the near term is to deter more overt steps towards independence on Taiwan. And as long as you can do that, you can get your people something, right? And so we have kept President Tsai, we have kept future presidents off the table for de jure independence. That's something, right? That's not nothing. Ultimately what he's saying, I think, is that by 2049, we would like to reintegrate Taiwan into the mainland. I'm trying to do the mental math. At 20 or 25 years, Xi Jinping will still be around. I don't think so. But I think in other words, I don't think he's made that explicitly part of his legacy or boxed himself into that position yet. And he has such a huge amount of control, I think, politically, that he can sort of define and redefine what the objectives really are, so that he's never really judged as failing, right? So, and he hasn't said, I don't think we have this problem in the United States where we're saying that, well, Xi Jinping clearly is, intent on occupying Taiwan by 2027, but no, he's never said that. I mean, he's never said that. I think what he said to the PLA, his message is, let's be ready, let's wake up, let's not be complacent, let's get over some of these problems. But he's never said, I think, that we have to achieve this historic mission in his tenure in office. And I think he wouldn't say that because it's something that he couldn't really necessarily deliver on. And I think in the back of his mind is history, right? So if you're the leader of China, you don't want to be Li Hongzhang, right, from the late Qing time. You don't want to be the leader that lost something, right, that you didn't have. You don't want to be the leader that made an effort at it, right? And so if he can keep things as they are now, I think that's sufficient. If he can make incremental progress through the tactics that I mentioned or the tactics that John mentioned, that's good. But again, I don't think he's boxed himself in. I don't think the public has boxed him in yet.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's stay right in the front here.
Hi, my name is Christopher Woody. I'm a journalist and Business Insider. I had a military question, so Joel perhaps best suited for it. U.S. defense officials have really talked very intensely about the issue of logistics recently, contested logistics. Their concerns are basically that China has the advantage in and around First Island chain, and the PLA is able to disrupt U.S. supply lines in the wider Pacific. My question is, how does the PLA feel about its own ability to sustain operations around Taiwan First Island chain and about its ability to disrupt U.S. reinforcement supply?
Well, I think they're very concerned about their own logistics problem for the reasons that I said earlier. When we look at studies from the PLA, when they calculate what they need in terms of everything from oil to ship capacity to medical supplies, for that matter, they have enormous anticipated needs given attrition, things that they frankly don't have on hand or stockpile. And the attrition piece is very important because that's a changing dimension. So Taiwan's defense is not static. Taiwan in the future, I think, will have great ability to threaten the PLA's ability to cross and sustain itself on an island where it has stockpiles. I think it's a huge challenge for it. With respect to the United States, I think they've long considered this as a key link or vulnerability for U.S. forces, but the U.S. position also is changing. I mean, it's not that, today in 2023, we are going to operate from the same model that we did in 1991 in the Gulf War, with huge iron mountains of pre-positioned supplies. I think, multiple services, especially the Marine Corps and the Army, are training to operate in much more austere conditions. And that would create problems, any communications conditions. I think that will create problems for the PLA if they think that this is going to be a trump card that they can use to try to deter us.
All right, let's see in the back. Anybody? All right, how about that? Right there.
Hello, I'm Satvik. I'm a grad student here at DW. So last year we saw William Lai visit the funeral of Shinzo Abe, and that kind of caused a little like hullabaloo between China and Japan. And like, how do you think that Taiwan's relationship with Japan in the future is going to be evolving, considering these cross-strait ties? And if there is any possibility for closer ties with Taiwan, or do you think that Japan is still trying to maintain some distance?
Response?
Sure. Make a quick response to that. Well, I think the answer to the question is that there's already some movement in terms of closer ties between Japan and Taiwan. I think some of that is taking place quietly. But particularly in terms of the security relationships. Now, much of that is still kind of, I think, indirectly channeled through the US government. But I think you'd expect in the future to see quiet but growing ties between Japan and Taiwan as sort of a natural part of the progression of the tightening of the security relationships between the United States and Japan and US and ROK and the Philippines and so forth.
Let me take this opportunity to ask a related question by Paul Carrington, who's online. He wants to hear what the panel's take is on AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US military organization that came in last year, including the possibility of Canada joining the alliance. In terms of AUKUS objectives and of course China's response here, a little further afield from Taiwan, but still making it more difficult, more difficult for China. Either of you, Joel, you want to?
I guess, just to start out with very concisely, I mean, Chinese, any kind of mini-lateral activities we're doing in the region are almost automatically perceived in China as somehow part of a coalition containment strategy. So that's no less true of the Quad than it is of AUKUS. AUKUS is even perhaps a step above the Quad because we don't have non-aligned India as part of it. We have two of our closest allies in conjunction with us. The nuclear submarine piece, of course, is very important for Australia and its perceptions of a Chinese naval threat in its backyard and its ability to project power out to the Pacific Islands. I don't think if the Chinese think that that's included, Australia is more likely to become involved in a Taiwan scenario. Right? I don't think they should lead to that conclusion because ultimately this is a political decision. And also the Chinese should realize that this is a negotiation that will not necessarily bear fruit for quite a long time. But again, this certainly will be perceived as a hostile element of U.S. hostile interest.
All right. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, State Foundation. I have a question regarding the U.S. strategy towards China vis-a-vis Taiwan. Now, China, I'll start a little bit with Nixon's visit to China.
I hope that you can keep the question short.
Yes, I will. Begging for a relationship. That is when all this gotten started, because Nixon promised that yes, Taiwan would no longer be defended by the United States. Now, and having looked at what's happening what has happened in Ukraine, I think if I were Xi Jinping or his advisor, I would be pretty nervous and I would want to break whatever the US is doing in Taiwan. Given that, US must reverse the things it has done from Nixon's visit all the way to now, which is to create a monster that China is. So given that, US must act and keep on fighting.
What is the, I'm sorry, is there a question here?
The question is, would the US do that?
Okay.
Would fight with China? That is what is needed.
Okay. Well, I think, Joel, you probably kind of already answered that in some sense, right? But
Important thing is, my view, just like very briefly, is China's view on this. What is our policy going to be in a future presidential administration? No one can say. I think the key thing is from China's perspective, I want them to believe that. I want them to believe that because it makes the war very, very difficult for them to succeed. So as long as we can sustain that belief, whether it's a perception or a misperception, I want them to believe that that will still be true.
All right, yes, in the back there, young lady.
Hi, thank you. I'm Leah Griffith, a reporter from the Asahi Shimbun. So I wanted to follow up on the AUKUS question. There's a number of important engagements coming up with the G7 summit, President Biden's stop in Papua New Guinea, the AUKUS meeting, and then the Shangri-La dialogue in June. So I just wanted you guys to comment on what you thought discussions on Taiwan might bear fruit from that.
Okay, so more political, question, do you want to?
I suppose I could try to answer it, although my answer would probably to the effect I don't really know. It's kind of vague right now as to what AUKUS is or what form it will actually take. Right now it's an informal arrangement between countries that already have separate existing security relationships with one another. There's security ties between the US and UK. There's security ties between the US and Australia. What does it mean if you try to tie everyone together? I don't claim to know the final answer. From what we've seen so far, it has been centered to date largely around that submarine deal. To me, the significance of that is largely that, wow, Australia is investing a whole lot of money in a nuclear submarine program. When you buy nuclear submarines, you're buying Cadillacs, right? You're investing a whole lot of money and a long training pipeline to get top of the line stuff. So you've got to regard it as really important to be prepared to invest that level of effort and that level of expense. And that in itself, that tells you things about what Australian defense planners see about the future role for their Navy. But in terms of what AUKUS might evolve into, I really could not say. I would hold my breath on that one for another year or two to wait and see.
I guess I would just on the Shangri-La dialogue and so forth, I think I would wait to see what kind of the joint statements does Taiwan figure at all. 2019 Shangri-La dialogue is where the US released its Indo-Pacific strategy. And there was a lot of talk about burden sharing as well as partnerships. So I was looking for that. There's a question here that from the virtual audience, and this goes to Rosalie. This is from Lawrence Musgrove, and is the question about potential internal threats to democracy in Taiwan. I mean, it's a kind of a broad question, but do you see anything from, he said, media, finance, technology sector? What are there any? We know that Taiwan is a thriving democracy, but I guess this question is, are there any chinks there?
Well, there's been some thoughts about, misinformation, disinformation, right? And you mentioned also psychological warfare, right? Competition in terms of how do we actually construct this whole, whether it's US or China relations or cross-strait relations. So in terms of that, I mean, I think I would second the general consensus that any time, right, we have constituted misinformation or disinformation efforts, it's always a threat to democracy. But I also agree with you. I think over the long term and also just like overall, like in general, I don't see any like imminent threats to them. I think it's been quite, simple, like, the model of like the way of office and all that. So I think the Taiwanese public is very pragmatic. And also, the voters, right, the wives, I think they know what they want, and they know what is actually practically possible. So yeah.
Right. I guess agreed. All right. Let's see. Okay, we didn't take any questions about that gentleman over there. We only have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll take 2-3 questions together. So please keep it short and I really do try.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Ken Scabe from Marvin Corporation. So I want to ask John about so to what extent the CGB leadership have been make a role in the relationship deterioration between US and China. So in other words, because you have been observed the US-China relationship for decades, and is this the so I believe the war between them is avoidable, and but do you think that this relationship deterioration is avoidable and inevitable? I mean, is this the structural issue between the US and China?
Okay, let me see. All right, how about these two in the side? Yeah, Jessica, John, and Pat.
Hi, my name is Ian. I'm a graduate student. Director Dotson, your anecdote about attitudes towards military service in Taiwan reminded me of folk saying in China that I learned, "Hao tie bu dang bing, hao han bu dang bing." So I just wanted to ask if you could talk about the role of the semiconductor industry and the central role of Taiwan in that, in how the U.S., EU, Japan, etc. might approach this issue.
Okay, last question, I'm afraid.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sean Dolan. I'm the program manager at the Institute for Korean Studies here at the Elliott School. I'm curious, it was touched on a little bit earlier, but about how there are these kind of unofficial, official relations between certain countries and Taiwan. And you look at seeing how the US and other countries have essentially de facto embassies in Taiwan and vice versa. I'm wondering why China still kind of tolerates these unofficial relations, and as China gets more and more aggressive, you can see that maybe potentially cracking down and no longer, allowing countries to have these relations that are unofficial, but essentially the same as an embassy, just all but in name. Thank you.
Okay, I think maybe Rosalie, on the last question, if you wanted to take that on Taiwan, and also on maybe John, I don't know, Joe, you want to jump in as last part? But we literally have maybe 3 minutes.
So maybe that's really quickly on the last one. So like, I mean, I guess, psychologically speaking, right? You don't want to push someone to despair, right? If Taiwan was left with absolutely no space, then you really, I mean, there could be, right? Let's say, declaring just like formal, you just don't want, so I think that's probably their thinking, right? You don't want to squeeze.
A safety valve. Yes. Okay, thank you. That's very good point.
Just very, very briefly on the question about semiconductors, I'm going to maybe slightly reinterpret that to say there is a discussion now in Washington that, this is a reason why China would want to use force against Taiwan is to seize all that. I think that's a total fallacy. I don't think there's actually a rationale. I mean, China has wanted Taiwan back since 1949, and whether they have semiconductors or not. And I also don't think that a deterrence strategy to hold that at risk would have any bearing whatsoever on China's calculus. I think all of that is a total sideshow from reality.
That's an interesting point, because that's not really how a lot of people see it, right? Yeah, thank you for clarifying. John?
Okay, again, I will try to keep this brief. I'm not an economist, so I'm going to avoid talking too much about semiconductors. The only comment I will make there is that I am prepared to call right now for an absolute moratorium on any more Americans making any more crazy comments about blowing up semiconductor facilities in Taiwan. I'm going to call for that right now. But again, the question that the gentleman asked in the corner in regards to the prospects for war between the United States and China. Well, I certainly hope that doesn't come about. Do I think it's structural or inevitable? So that gets into the Thucydides trap is often invoked now. Are the U.S. and China sort of locked in a deteriorating security dynamic of the sort that Athens and Sparta looked at that took them into the Peloponnesian War? I don't think so. I don't think anything in human affairs is inevitable. I don't believe that external structural forces completely control human behavior. and that we have agency over these things and these decisions. So no, I don't think war is inevitable, and I would certainly very much like to see that avoided, as I think almost any sane person would. But we are entering a period where there are some dangerous dynamics that make the possibility of war real and growing.
All right, well, my apologies to those of you who I questions who I couldn't take. I'm sorry about that. Also, we had a couple of questions left on the virtual board as well, but I think all in all, you'll have to agree that this has been an extremely stimulating conversation from 3 different angles that I think really enriched the discussions on Taiwan in this city. So please join me in thanking my panelists for terrific.